The Zodiac Killer, Part 1. The Stage of Fear. The 1960s in America were not an age of peace. The images we carry of that decade, the flowers in long hair, the protests for peace, the Woodstock stage under a rising sun, these were only one side of the coin. The other side was darker, bloodier. The Vietnam War raged on television screens every evening. Families gathered for dinner and watched images of napalm and body bags. Assassinations had shattered the nation's faith. John F. Kennedy gunned down in Dallas. Martin Luther King Jr. taken from the balcony of a Memphis motel. Robert Kennedy bleeding to death on a kitchen floor in Los Angeles. The American dream was fractured. The American people were restless. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. And in California, a land of beaches, music, and sunshine shadows crept closer. In Los Angeles, the Manson family sharpened their knives. In San Francisco, drugs and protests painted the streets in chaos. And in the quiet towns around the Bay Area, young couples parked their cars along dark country roads, unaware that a phantom was waiting for them. This phantom would come to call himself Zodiac. Zodiac was not an ordinary killer. He was not satisfied with silence. He wanted to be heard. He wanted to be feared. And he wanted to be remembered. Most killers flee the spotlight. The Zodiac stepped into it. He gave himself a name. He created a symbol, a circle with a cross through its heart, like the scope of a rifle. He demanded newspaper headlines. He mocked the police. He promised new deaths if his words were ignored. He transformed murder into theater, and he forced America to become his audience. But before the letters, before the ciphers, before the nation knew his name, there were bodies. It began on the cold night of December 20th, 1968. Lake Herman Road. 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen. Jensen were on their very first date. They had spent the evening at a Christmas concert. Afterwards, they drove in David's mother's Rambler station wagon, ending their night on a lonely stretch of road outside Vallejo, a place where teenagers often went for privacy. It was quiet, the kind of silence only found in the countryside. No city lights, no witnesses. Just the cold air, the stars above, and two young lives that had no idea the end was near. At around 11:00 p.m., another car pulled up beside theirs. Someone stepped out. A gun was raised. David was shot at close range in the head. Betty Lou ran terrified, but the bullets followed. 5 entered her back. She collapsed only a short distance from the car. 10 shots fired. Both teenagers dead. By the time their bodies were discovered, the killer was gone. The police searched for answers. But there were no suspects, no clear motive. No robbery, no assault, just senseless death. For 6 months, the case went cold. And then, the phantom returned. July 4th, 1969. Blue Rock Springs Park, Vallejo. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Mageau were parked in a quiet lot. Fireworks from Independence Day echoed in the distance. At about midnight, another car pulled in. A man stepped out carrying a flashlight. He walked up to their window. Without a word, he raised a gun and opened fire. Michael was hit several times but somehow survived. Darlene was struck as well. She did not. The killer calmly returned to his car and drove away. But this time, the phantom did not remain silent. Minutes later, the Vallejo Police Department received a phone call. The voice was calm, detached, almost mechanical. The caller confessed not only to shooting Darlene and Michael, but also to killing David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen 6 months earlier. It was the first time the world heard the voice of the Zodiac. And then came the letters. In the weeks that followed, 3 nearly identical letters were sent to 3 newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Examiner, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Each letter began the same way: "This is the Zodiac speaking." This was his introduction, his grand entrance. He described the murders in chilling details only the killer could know. And each letter contained a cipher, a strange puzzle of symbols and shapes. The Zodiac demanded that the newspapers publish his ciphers on the front page. If they did not, he warned more lives would be taken. The editors faced an impossible choice: deny him and risk bloodshed, or print his words and give him the attention he craved. They published them. The public was stunned. For the first time, ordinary Americans weren't just reading about a killer. They were reading words from the killer himself. At kitchen tables across California, families stared at lines of cryptic symbols, trying to solve a puzzle written by a murderer. He promised that if anyone cracked his code, his identity would be revealed. Fear spread like wildfire. Who was this man? Was he their neighbor, their co-worker? Could he be sitting in the same diner, smiling politely, while secretly writing threats that held an entire city hostage? For weeks, the Bay Area was gripped by paranoia. The cipher, later known as the 408 symbol cipher, was eventually solved by a high school teacher and his wife. But it did not reveal a name. Instead, it revealed a chilling statement. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest, because man is the most dangerous animal of all. This was not a confession of guilt. It was a manifesto of pleasure. The Zodiac claimed murder as entertainment. The public realized then that this was not just a criminal. This was a monster in human skin. More letters followed. More threats. More symbols. He taunted police. He mocked detectives. He demanded to be printed to be heard. He promised new killings. And he signed everything with the same chilling mark, a circle with a cross through its heart. He was no longer a faceless killer. He was a character, a brand, a phantom, who had turned himself into a household name. The Zodiac Killer had arrived. But the story was only beginning. The letters were only the first act. Soon there would be more victims, more ciphers, more confusion. And as the bodies fell, the nation would be drawn deeper into a nightmare that to this day has no ending. The Zodiac was not finished. He had only just begun. The Zodiac Killer Part 2, The Theater of Blood. By the end of the summer of 1969, the Zodiac had already killed. He had already written. He had already terrified. But what came next would be unlike anything before. The phantom was about to step out of the shadows into the daylight. September 27, 1969, Lake Berryessa. The afternoon sun shimmered across the water. Families picnicked along the shoreline. College students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard had found a quiet spot on the edge of the lake. They spread out a blanket, opened books, enjoyed the calm of the day. But as the hours passed, they noticed a figure in the distance, a man watching them. At first it seemed nothing unusual, perhaps a fisherman, perhaps a hiker. But soon the figure drew closer. The man wore a hood, a strange black executioner's hood, with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. Around his chest was a bib-like garment marked with a symbol, the circle and cross of the Zodiac. In his hands, he carried a gun. He walked directly toward Brian and Cecilia. When he spoke, his voice was flat, controlled. He claimed he was an escaped convict. He said he needed money, food, and their car to get to Mexico. Brian, terrified but steady, tried to reason with him. He offered the man his wallet. He pleaded for their lives. But the Zodiac had not come for money. He had come for blood. He ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's hands with a length of clothesline. Then he tied Cecilia's hands himself. And then, without warning, he drew a knife. The blade rose. The blade fell, again and again. Brian was stabbed 6 times in the back. Cecilia 10 times in the chest and abdomen. Her screams echoed across the lake. And then, silence. The Zodiac walked away, leaving them bleeding in the sun. Before leaving the area entirely, he took the time to leave his signature. On the door of Brian's Volkswagen, he drew the crosshair symbol, and beneath it he wrote the dates of his previous murders: December 20th, 1968, July 4, 1969, and now September 27, 1969. It was a tally, a scoreboard of death. Brian miraculously survived. Cecilia did not. The Zodiac had killed again, and this time he had shown the world a new level of cruelty. 2 weeks later, he struck again. October 11, 1969, San Francisco. It was late at night in the Presidio Heights neighborhood. A quiet, middle-class area, children asleep in their beds, families behind locked doors. At the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, a yellow taxicab was parked. Inside sat Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver. His last fare of the evening had directed him here, but the passenger was no ordinary rider. Without warning, the man pulled out a gun and shot Paul Stein in the head at point-blank range. He then leaned over, calmly tore a piece of Stein's blood-stained shirt and tucked it into his pocket. Through the cab's windows, children in a nearby house saw the murder unfold. They called the police. By the time officers arrived, the killer had vanished into the night. The crime stunned San Francisco. For the first time, the Zodiac had killed in the heart of the city, not on a lonely road, not in the shadows, but in a residential neighborhood. He had crossed a line. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter. Enclosed was a piece of Paul Stein's bloody shirt. This was proof. Proof that the writer of the letters and the killer in the cab were the same man. Proof that the Zodiac was not bluffing, not pretending, not some crank in a basement. He was real. He was deadly. And he was watching. The letter taunted the police. It mocked the city. It promised more deaths. And in words dripping with arrogance, the Zodiac wrote, "School children make nice targets. I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." The threat was unlike anything California had ever faced. Suddenly, every parent, every teacher, every bus driver looked at the yellow school buses with terror. Police cars escorted buses to and from schools. Officers armed with rifles watched over children as they played. The Zodiac had created not just crime, but terror. The city was now his stage, and its people his audience of fear. In his letters, he sneered at detectives. He mocked their failures. He called them the blue pigs. He even described the murder of Paul Stein in graphic detail, savoring the horror he had unleashed. And always at the bottom of his letters, his chilling mark, the circle and cross. By now, the Zodiac was more than a killer. He was a phantom celebrity. His words were printed on front pages. His symbol was known by every family in the Bay Area. He had become a myth in real time, a story children whispered about in schoolyards, a nightmare adults could not escape. And the killings, the letters, the threats, they were far from over. The Zodiac Killer, Part 3, The Voice of the Phantom. Fear has a way of spreading faster than fire. And in the winter of 1969, San Francisco was burning with it. The Zodiac had taken his stage. He had written his name in blood. He had threatened the lives of children, and now he began to speak more often. His voice was not through sound, but through paper, through the black ink of his letters scrawled in a hand that seemed hurried, manic, and taunting. The letters continue. In the weeks after Paul Stein's murder, newspapers began to receive a steady drip of Zodiac's words. Some letters were long, almost rambling. Others were short-cutting like knives. Each carried the weight of dread. One contained another piece of Stein's bloodied shirt, as if the killer wanted to remind the city I was here. I was real. I touched death, and I will do it again. He referred to himself not as a suspect, not as a criminal, but as an executioner. He called the police the blue pigs and described his pleasure at watching them scramble. He relished their failures. He mocked their lack of progress. And then came the threats. Zodiac promised that if his letters were not printed, if his words were not given the stage he demanded, he would attack again. He spoke of bombs. He drew diagrams of explosives complete with wires and switches, and claimed he had buried them in the hills around the Bay Area. Police scoured the countryside searching for the devices. None were ever found. But the fear they inspired was very real, the 340 cipher. On November 8, 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received what would become one of the most infamous puzzles in American history, the 340-character cipher. It was written in a grid filled with strange symbols, geometric shapes, and letters that seemed meaningless. Unlike the earlier cipher, this one resisted all attempts at solution. For decades, it remained unsolved, a haunting riddle from the hand of a murderer. When experts tried, they found nothing but chaos. Cryptographers, military code breakers, amateur puzzle solvers all failed. The cipher became a symbol of the Zodiac himself, unknowable, unsolvable, beyond capture. Only in 2020 would a team finally break the code, revealing another chilling message that mocked law enforcement and declared he was not afraid of the gas chamber. But in 1969, the cipher was a locked door with no key. Public fear. The people of California now lived with a phantom in their midst. It was not just the murders that terrified them. It was the idea that the Zodiac could be anywhere, anyone. Every anonymous man on a bus. Every figure in a diner. Every stranger on the street. Could he be sitting at the next table sipping coffee, writing his next letter in a notebook? Rumors spread. Some claimed to have seen him. Others believed they had cracked his codes. Schools held emergency drills. Parents refused to let their children ride buses. The Zodiac had become more than a man. He was an idea, and ideas cannot be arrested. The letters grow stranger. In December 1969, another letter arrived. This time, the Zodiac described the joy he took in watching people run, scream, die. He called killing the best part of life. He fantasized about an afterlife where his victims would become his slaves. These were not the words of a man begging for forgiveness. They were the words of someone who viewed himself as a god of death. He sketched diagrams of bombs large enough he claimed to kill dozens at once. He threatened more shootings. He drew crosshair symbols over maps marking potential killing grounds. Each new letter was a performance. Each was designed to terrify. Each was a reminder that the Zodiac was out there somewhere watching. Police frustration. Inside the police departments of San Francisco, Vallejo, and Napa, detectives worked around the clock. They interviewed suspects. They examined handwriting. They studied ballistics. But every lead ended in smoke. The problem was not just evidence. The problem was the killer himself. Zodiac understood the media. He understood fear. He knew that even without striking again, his words could paralyze an entire city. And so detectives were caught in a trap. Every time a letter arrived, they had to respond. Every time he demanded attention, they gave it. And every time they printed his words, they spread his legend further. The killer was winning the game of identity. In several letters, the Zodiac teased at his name. He claimed his ciphers held the truth of who he was. He promised that if people solved them, they would know him. But each time, the truth dissolved into more riddles. One letter was signed not with a name, but with a string of strange symbols. Was it a code? Was it a joke? Was it nothing at all? The police were no closer to identifying him. And the public, instead of feeling relief, only felt more dread. For what is more terrifying than a killer without a face? A city held hostage. By the end of 1969, San Francisco was a city under siege, not by bombs, not by armies, but by one man and his pen. The Zodiac had achieved what few killers ever could. He had made himself immortal in life. His crimes, his words, his symbol. They had become folklore, passed in whispers from neighbor to neighbor, carried in headlines from coast to coast. And as the calendar turned to 1970, there was no sign that the nightmare would end. The Zodiac was still writing. The Zodiac was still hunting. And the Zodiac was still laughing. The Zodiac Killer Part 4. The Ghost in the Letters. The year was 1970. A new decade had dawned. America was trying to leave behind the chaos of the 60s to wash away the blood of assassinations, riots, and wars. But in California, one ghost would not rest. The Zodiac was still writing, still haunting, still playing his game. The letter of April 20th, 1970. It arrived at the offices of the San Francisco Chronicle. The envelope was unremarkable, but inside was a short, chilling message. The Zodiac demanded attention once again. He threatened to blow up a school bus, repeating his obsession with slaughtering children. Enclosed was a crude diagram, a circle with crosshairs, and a drawing of a bomb with wires protruding. It was a theater of fear. The Zodiac understood that the image of an unexploded bomb was enough to paralyze a city. He did not need to kill that day. His words were enough. The My Name is letter. On April 20th, 1970, another letter came. This one was stranger still. At the bottom, the Zodiac included a cipher of just 13 characters claiming it revealed his name. The code looked simple, almost playful, a jumble of symbols, letters, and marks. But like so many of his other puzzles, it led nowhere. To this day, the 13-symbol cipher has never been definitively solved. Was it a clue or was it a joke? Did it hold the key to his identity, or was it yet another cruel trick dangling hope before police and the public only to snatch it away? The Zodiac was not just killing bodies, he was killing certainty. The button letter. In June 1970, another letter arrived known as the button letter. In it, the Zodiac demanded that people wear buttons featuring his crosshair symbol. He claimed he would not kill again if people complied. If not, he warned the murders would continue. He drew diagrams of more bombs detailed enough to unsettle even military experts. He spoke again of watching buses explode, of children dying. And he mocked the police who could not stop him. No one wore the buttons. And still, no one caught him, the map and the bomb. Perhaps the strangest of all came in July 1970. This letter included a map of the San Francisco Bay Area with a crosshair symbol drawn over Mount Diablo, an isolated peak that looms above the East Bay. The Zodiac claimed that by solving his code, one could find the location of a bomb he had buried. The cipher contained 32 characters, yet like so many before, it resisted all solutions. No bomb was ever found. But again, the damage was done. Mount Diablo itself became a place of fear. Hikers who once climbed its trails now looked uneasily at the ground, imagining buried explosives. Parents warned their children away. The Zodiac had turned a mountain into a monument of terror. The strange messages continue. Throughout 1970, the letters kept coming. Some rambled. Some were direct. Some contained threats so outlandish they seemed like fiction. In one, the Zodiac claimed he had shot a man sitting in a parked car. In another, he threatened mass killings at random. He wrote of collecting slaves for his afterlife, repeating the bizarre philosophy he had introduced before. And always the letters ended the same way, with the circle and cross. A signature of madness. The first suspects. As the letters multiplied, police began to close in on possible suspects. One man stood out. Arthur Lee Allen, a troubled man with a history of violence, an obsession with young children, and a disturbing fascination with codes. He had been in the area of several killings. He owned a watch with the Zodiac's crosshair symbol engraved on it. To detectives, Allen seemed perfect, too perfect. But when handwriting experts compared his script to the Zodiac's letters, the match was inconclusive. His fingerprints did not align. And though suspicion would haunt him for the rest of his life, there was no evidence strong enough to arrest him. The frustration was unbearable. The killer seemed to be right there in reach, yet untouchable. The fear in the air. By late 1970, the Zodiac was no longer just a story in California. His legend had spread across America. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and beyond printed his letters. Television anchors spoke his name, and with each word the fear grew. The Zodiac had discovered the greatest truth of all. A killer does not need to kill to terrify. He only needs to speak. But while the public recoiled in horror, the Zodiac smiled from the shadows. He had everything he wanted: fame, power, control, and he was far from finished. The Zodiac Killer, Part 5. Whispers in the Dark. The year was 1971. The world was changing. America was pulling itself deeper into the Vietnam War. Protests filled the streets. The Manson family murders still lingered in the public's mind. And in San Francisco, the shadow of the Zodiac remained. But something had shifted. Where once the press printed his words on the front page, now his letters were pushed further back. Where once the city lived in daily terror, now that terror had begun to dull into a constant, weary anxiety. The Zodiac was still out there. Everyone knew it. But silence is its own kind of horror. The letters continue. In March 1971, the Los Angeles Times received a letter from someone claiming to be the Zodiac. It referenced a young woman named Cherry Jo Bates, who had been murdered in Riverside, California in 1966. Her case was brutal, stabbed to death near a college library, her throat slashed. Months later, her father and the police received typed letters taunting them. Now in 1971, the Zodiac claimed responsibility. He wrote, "I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity. They are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there." The possibility sent shockwaves through investigators. If true, it meant Zodiac had been killing years before Lake Herman Road. It meant his spree was larger, longer, and more terrifying than anyone had guessed. But was it true? Or was it another trick? To this day, the connection between Zodiac and Cherry Jo Bates remains unresolved. Some experts believe he was involved. Others believe he simply wanted credit for a crime that was already infamous. Either way, the letter served its purpose. It pulled the public's eyes back toward him. The letters of 1971 to 1972. More letters followed. Some were short. Some rambled. Many repeated threats he had already made. He spoke of collecting slaves for the afterlife. He wrote about his bombs, though none were ever found. He mocked the police, sneering that they would never catch him. But something was different. The letters felt less sharp, less terrifying than before. Perhaps the novelty had worn off. Perhaps the Zodiac himself was losing interest. Or perhaps he was preparing for something worse. The pace slows. By 1972, the flood of letters began to slow. Months would pass without a word. Then suddenly, a new message would arrive, as if to remind the world, "I'm still here." Each time the cycle repeated. Police scrambled. Newspapers debated whether to print. The public shivered, but over time the fear became routine. The Zodiac was no longer an urgent crisis. He was a ghost in the background, a monster who might strike again, but might not. And that uncertainty was its own torment. The possible crimes. Throughout the early 1970s, a series of killings were whispered about, speculated upon, and tied sometimes loosely, sometimes convincingly, to the Zodiac. A young nurse found murdered in her apartment. A couple attacked on a beach. A taxi driver shot in a distant town. Each case had similarities: the randomness, the brutality, the lack of motive. Each was examined under the harsh light of the Zodiac's legend. But the connections were never proven. Some investigators argued that Zodiac had long since stopped killing. Others believed he continued, but disguised his work to avoid detection. Still others believed that new killers were copying his style, muddying the waters further. In truth, no one knew, and that was the Zodiac's greatest weapon. The shift in public interest. By 1973, the American public had grown weary. The Zodiac was no longer the front-page specter he once was. Other horrors had taken his place: the war overseas, the rise of serial killers like the Manson family, and soon Ted Bundy. The Zodiac was fading from the spotlight. But this fading did not mean safety. For what could be more terrifying than a killer who disappears but is never caught? What could be more dreadful than silence, when you know the monster is still alive, still watching, still waiting? The Zodiac had given the world a taste of his cruelty. Now he let them imagine the rest. The silence. As the 1970s moved forward, the letters came less and less often. Some years none at all. And in that silence, paranoia grew. If the Zodiac was not writing, did that mean he was gone? Or did it mean he was preparing something larger, something darker, something no one could anticipate? For detectives, the case became a maze without an exit. For the public, the Zodiac became less a man and more a myth, whispered like a ghost story told late at night, half believed, half doubted. But myths have power, and the Zodiac knew this better than anyone. By the mid-1970s, the killer had drifted into legend. His name still carried fear, but not urgency. He was an unsolved puzzle, an unfinished nightmare. Yet no one ever forgot. Because in California, every shadow on a lonely road, every stranger's glance, every anonymous letter, all carried the same silent question. Is it him? The Zodiac Killer, Part 6. The Suspects in the Shadows. Paul. The mid-1970s arrived. The Zodiac had not been heard from in months, then years. The silence was deafening. Police stations that once received his cryptic letters now opened their mailboxes to nothing but dust and routine. The newspapers that had once been forced to print his taunts had moved on to other stories: Watergate, the war in Vietnam, the rise of other killers across America. The Zodiac, it seemed, had vanished, but the fear never left. The silence of a killer. For investigators, the quiet was unbearable. Did silence mean he was dead? Did it mean he was in prison for another crime? Or worse, did it mean he was still out there, still killing, but simply no longer writing about it? Some detectives believed the Zodiac had grown bored of the game. Others thought he had found a new life, perhaps even started a family, blending into society as though nothing had happened. The most chilling theory was simpler still: he no longer needed to write. He had already achieved what he wanted: immortality. The suspects multiply. With no new letters to analyze, investigators turned their focus toward suspects. Dozens of men were considered. Some were examined and dismissed. Others remained under suspicion for decades. And one name rose above them all: Arthur Lee Allen. He was a former school teacher fired for inappropriate behavior with children. He lived in Vallejo, not far from the sites of Zodiac's confirmed attacks. He was described by acquaintances as strange, aggressive, obsessed with weapons and codes. He once told a friend that he dreamed of hunting people, of stalking them like animals. When police searched his home, they found disturbing items, knives, sexual materials, and writings that hinted at a dark inner world. Perhaps most damning was his watch, a brand called Zodiac, bearing the same crosshair symbol the killer used in his letters. To detectives, it was almost too perfect, but there was a problem. Handwriting experts compared Allen's writing with the Zodiac's letters. The match was inconclusive. His fingerprints did not align. His DNA decades later would not match the partial profiles taken from the envelopes. Arthur Lee Allen remained the prime suspect. But suspicion is not proof. And proof was what they lacked: other suspects. Allen was not the only man under the microscope. Rick Marshall, a projectionist who lived near San Francisco, eccentric and reclusive, was once considered. His love of old films and codes drew police attention, but nothing concrete tied him to the crimes. Lawrence Kane, a salesman with a criminal record, was identified by one surviving victim in a police lineup. Yet the evidence against him never held. Dozens of other men, some fitting the description, some not, were questioned, shadowed, interrogated. None could be proven guilty. The Zodiac seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once, a phantom who could wear any face, who could slip through any net. The public's fascination. As the 1970s closed, the Zodiac was no longer dominating headlines. But he had not been forgotten. Writers, filmmakers, and amateur sleuths began to take up the case. Books were published, dissecting every detail, every letter, every crime scene. Talk shows featured experts debating his motives. The Zodiac was transforming from a living terror into a cultural obsession. He had become, in some twisted sense, a part of American folklore. A story told around campfires, whispered in darkened rooms, shared by those who wanted to feel the chill of an unsolved mystery. And this was perhaps his final victory. For while his hands may have gone still, his legend lived on. The shadow of doubt. For investigators, the 1970s ended in frustration. The case was no closer to resolution than when it began. The files grew heavier, the leads colder. Witnesses aged, memories faded. The survivors carried scars that never healed, and always the circle and cross hovered in their minds, mocking them, reminding them that justice had never been served. The Zodiac had slipped into the shadows. But shadows do not vanish. They linger. They wait. They remind us that darkness is never far away. By the dawn of the 1980s, one truth had become clear. The Zodiac Killer had changed America forever. And though his crimes had grown distant in time, his mystery was only beginning. The Zodiac Killer Part 7. A cold case in the spotlight. By the dawn of the 1980s, the Zodiac Killer had become a ghost. It had been nearly a decade since his last confirmed letter. Nearly a decade since the streets of San Francisco trembled with the fear of his name. But the silence did not bring peace. It brought something worse. Uncertainty. The cold case files. In police departments across California, the Zodiac files grew thicker with dust. The once frantic investigations had slowed to a crawl. Detectives moved on to new cases, new crimes, new killers, but the Zodiac case was never closed. It sat there heavy and unsolved like a wound that refused to heal. Every so often, a new lead would surface. A tip from a citizen convinced their neighbor was the killer. A cryptic letter mailed to a newsroom. A suspect who seemed promising, if only for a moment. But each lead ended the same way: dead. The Zodiac remained free. Or perhaps he was dead. No one knew. The rise of the Zodiac in culture. As the police struggled with silence, the public's fascination grew. In 1986, a book titled Zodiac, written by reporter Robert Graysmith, reignited the fire. Graysmith had followed the case since the beginning, obsessing over the killer's letters and ciphers. His book painted a vivid portrait of the crimes, the suspects, and the endless mystery. The book was a sensation. It reintroduced the Zodiac to a new generation, and for many, it solidified Arthur Lee Allen as the prime suspect. Television followed. Documentaries aired exploring the crimes in chilling detail. Talk shows debated the killer's motives. Amateur sleuths began forming their own theories, diving into the codes, searching for hidden meanings. The Zodiac was no longer just a killer. He was a myth, a riddle, a puzzle to be solved. The new letters. During the 1980s and 1990s, several new letters surfaced claiming to be from the Zodiac. Some contained threats. Others repeated old phrases like slaves for the afterlife. But experts disagreed. The handwriting was inconsistent. The style seemed forced. Many believed they were hoaxes written by copycats eager to insert themselves into the legend. Yet a few of the letters carried enough authenticity to remain debated. Perhaps the Zodiac had returned. Or perhaps the world had simply learned to mimic his voice. The investigations continue. Despite the years, police never gave up. New detectives inherited the case, each hoping to be the one who solved the mystery. Handwriting experts continued to analyze the letters. Cryptographers wrestled with the unsolved ciphers. Forensic scientists tested what little physical evidence remained, hoping advances in technology would finally unmask the killer. But again and again, the case defied resolution. Every path led to fog. Every suspect slipped away. The suspects revisited. Arthur Lee Allen remained the center of suspicion. Graysmith's book had painted him as the obvious culprit, and many believed it. But the evidence remained circumstantial. Others pushed alternative theories. Some argued for Rick Marshall, eccentric and reclusive. Others insisted on Lawrence Kane, whose criminal past and proximity to the crimes made him a candidate. Still others believed the Zodiac was someone no one had ever suspected. A man who blended so perfectly into the crowd that he would never be found. The debates raged, but no answer came. The 1990s, new tools, old ghosts. As the 1990s advanced, forensic science leapt forward. DNA testing became possible, a tool unimaginable in the days of the first murders. Investigators revisited the evidence, swabbing stamps and envelopes from the Zodiac's letters, searching for genetic traces. The results were frustrating. Some samples were too degraded. Others revealed DNA, but it did not match Arthur Lee Allen nor any other prime suspect. Once again, hope dissolved into uncertainty. The cultural obsession grows. By the end of the 1990s, the Zodiac had fully transformed from a headline into a legend. He appeared in novels, in songs, in films. He became a symbol of unsolved evil, a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be unraveled. For the families of the victims, it was salt in the wound. Their loved ones had become footnotes in a myth, their suffering transformed into entertainment. But for the world at large, the Zodiac was irresistible. A story without an ending. And endings, after all, are what we crave the most. The turn of the century. As the 1990s drew to a close, investigators prepared for a new era. The Zodiac case was old, but not forgotten. And with each advance in science, each new theory, each retelling in books and film, hope flickered once more. Maybe, just maybe, the 21st century would bring the truth. But the truth, like the Zodiac himself, remained hidden in the shadows. By the dawn of the 2000s, the Zodiac was not just a killer. He was a cultural ghost haunting the line between history and legend, crime and myth. And though decades had passed, one fact remained unchanged. No one had ever unmasked the man behind the circle and the cross. The Zodiac Killer, Part 8. The Internet Age of Obsession. The year 2000 arrived with fireworks and the quiet dread of Y2K. The world braced for a digital collapse that never came. But in the shadows of California, one of the 20th century's darkest mysteries was stirring once again. The Zodiac Killer. The case goes digital. For decades, the Zodiac case had lived in filing cabinets and police archives. Now, with the internet booming, those files began to leak into the digital world. Amateur sleuths found each other online. They shared scans of letters, photographs of crime scenes, maps of California. Forums sprouted up where strangers debated suspects late into the night. It was no longer just detectives chasing the Zodiac. It was thousands of ordinary people, each convinced they might find the missing piece. The case had gone viral before the word viral even existed. The 2000s and DNA hope. Technology had advanced far beyond what investigators of the 1970s could imagine. DNA testing was sharper, faster, more reliable. Police turned again to the Zodiac's letters, hoping to lift a genetic fingerprint from the saliva on stamps and envelopes. The results were both promising and frustrating. A partial DNA profile was obtained, not enough to identify a suspect, but enough to eliminate some. Arthur Lee Allen, the man long suspected, was ruled out. His DNA did not match. For many, this was devastating. Allen had been the face of the Zodiac in the public's mind for years. If not him, then who? The question only deepened the mystery. 2007 Zodiac returns to the screen. In 2007, director David Fincher released Zodiac, a film based on Robert Graysmith's book. It starred Jake Gyllenhaal, Robert Downey Jr., and Mark Ruffalo. The movie was meticulous, chilling, and relentless in its detail. It recreated the murders, the letters, the investigations, the frustration. And it reignited the world's obsession. For many viewers, it was their first introduction to the killer. For others, it reopened old fears. The film did more than entertain. It gave the Zodiac back his voice, and it placed him firmly in the 21st century imagination. The Internet Detectives. While Hollywood was retelling the story, the Internet was rewriting it. On forums like ZodiacKiller.com and later Reddit, armchair detectives pored over the evidence. They analyzed the ciphers line by line. They mapped the killer's movements with digital precision. They compared handwriting, faces, even astrological charts. Some declared new suspects. Others debunked them. It was chaos. It was obsession. And it was exactly what the Zodiac would have wanted, a game without end, a riddle that consumed the minds of thousands. The unsolved ciphers. Among the case's greatest mysteries were the unsolved codes. The Zodiac had sent 4 major ciphers. The first, the 408 symbol cipher, was cracked by a school teacher and his wife in 1969. It revealed chilling words about killing being the most thrilling experience. But the later ciphers, the 340, the 13, and the 32, resisted all attempts at solution. For decades, they stood as walls of symbols mocking cryptographers and amateurs alike. In the 2000s, computer power allowed new attempts. Algorithms tested millions of combinations. Linguists applied fresh theories, but the codes held their secrets, until one day they did not. The breakthrough approaches. By the late 2010s, an international team of codebreakers working online finally cracked the infamous 340 cipher. It had taken 51 years. The message, while chilling, revealed less than many hoped. The Zodiac once again mocked the police and denied being afraid of the gas chamber. It was a sneer from the past, echoing into the present. The solution proved something vital even decades later. The Zodiac still had the power to control attention, to twist minds, to haunt the living. The culture of Zodiac. By the 2010s, the Zodiac was more than a cold case. He was a cultural phenomenon. Podcasts dissected every clue. Documentaries revisited every crime scene. Conventions were held where experts and fans debated theories. And with every retelling, the lines blurred further between fact and myth, between evidence and legend. The Zodiac had become eternal, not in the afterlife he fantasized about, but in the endless obsession of the living. The legacy of fear. For the families of the victims, the internet age brought both hope and pain. Hope because fresh eyes meant fresh chances. Perhaps someone somewhere would finally solve the puzzle. Pain because their tragedies were now consumed by strangers, dissected as entertainment, debated like riddles. To them, the Zodiac was not a myth. He was a thief who had stolen sons' daughters' futures, and he had never paid for it. Soon, the dawn of a new era. By the close of the 2010s, the Zodiac case had grown larger than life. He was a killer, yes, but he was also a story, a brand, a permanent part of American darkness. And though half a century had passed, one question remained unchanged. Who was the man behind the circle and the cross? The Zodiac Killer. Part 9. The 21st Century Hunt. The year was 2020. The world was changing, a global pandemic, political upheaval, streets emptied of life. But even in chaos, the old ghosts stirred, and none stirred louder than the Zodiac Killer. The rise of genetic genealogy. In the late 2010s, a new weapon had entered the world of criminal investigation, genetic genealogy. By cross-referencing DNA from crime scenes with millions of profiles uploaded to public ancestry databases, cold cases once thought unsolvable were cracking open. The Golden State Killer was identified in 2018 after decades of terror and silence. Suddenly, the Zodiac case, long frozen in myth, seemed vulnerable again. Could DNA from an old envelope, a stamp, or a lock of hair finally unmask the faceless phantom? The Casebreakers announcement. In October 2021, a group of more than 40 independent investigators calling themselves the Casebreakers held a press conference. They declared that they had solved the case. According to their research, the Zodiac Killer was Gary Francis Post, a man who had lived quietly in California, a former Air Force veteran with a violent past. Post had died in 2018, never facing justice. The group presented photographs, scars, and alleged links between Post and the composite sketch of the Zodiac. They argued that his military background fit the profile, that his proximity to crime scenes was too great to ignore, that coded messages even contained his name. The world took notice. Headlines blazed across news outlets. At last was the Zodiac finally unmasked. The backlash, but the celebration was short-lived. Within days, law enforcement agencies and FBI spokespeople issued statements. The case remained open, they said. Poste had not been confirmed. The evidence was circumstantial. Cryptography experts questioned the decoding methods used by the casebreakers. Critics called the claim sensational, more theater than truth. The internet erupted. On forums, some hailed the breakthrough. Others mocked it, dissecting every photograph, every claim. And once again, the Zodiac became what he had always been, a mirror reflecting obsession and division, the digital battlefield. In the 2020s, the Zodiac case was no longer fought only in police stations. It was waged in comment threads, YouTube documentaries, Twitter arguments, Reddit posts, Discord servers. Every cipher was reanalyzed. Every suspect re-examined. Artificial intelligence tools were even applied, scanning handwriting, analyzing linguistic patterns. Each new theory sparked a frenzy. Each debunking sparked another. It was the same endless cycle played out on a global stage, and always in the center, the same circle with a cross through it. The victims in the shadows. While the world debated, the families of the victims still waited. Decades had passed since the murders, and many parents and siblings were gone. But children, nieces, nephews remained. They had lived entire lives under the shadow of a crime unsolved. For them, the internet wars meant little. They did not care about Reddit fame or YouTube views. They cared about closure, and once again, it slipped through their fingers. The DNA question. Investigators confirmed that DNA testing was ongoing. The problem was degradation. Decades of handling had contaminated many samples. Others were too faint to yield results. Still, whispers persisted. A profile existed. Somewhere in a database, a match might one day appear. But for now, the trail remained cold, and the Zodiac, whether alive in memory or gone in death, remained untouchable. The myth in the modern age. As the 2020s advanced, the Zodiac became more than just a killer. He was a streaming topic, a podcast favorite, a YouTube empire. His ciphers appeared on t-shirts, his symbol tattooed on skin. He had transcended mortality, becoming folklore. And that perhaps was his final victory. Because whether Gary Francis Poste was truly the man, or whether the Zodiac was someone else entirely, the truth no longer mattered to many. What mattered was the story, the fear, the mystery that could not be silenced. The endless question. So here we stand more than 50 years later. The files are older. The witnesses fewer, the evidence fragile, but the question remains the same. Who was the Zodiac Killer? Some believe the answer is already known. Others believe it will never be known. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest horror of all. That a man could step from the shadows, kill, taunt, and vanish into the crowd, and half a century later still hold us captive. The Zodiac Killer, Part 10, The Face in the Dark. The story of the Zodiac Killer is not just a story of murder. It is the story of a game, a riddle, a mirror held up to America's darkest fears. From the lonely highways of Northern California, to the newsrooms of San Francisco, to the screens of the 21st century, the Zodiac carved his symbol into history, not with bullets alone, not with knives, but with silence, with puzzles, with the endless hunger of human curiosity. The psychology of the Zodiac. Who was he? A soldier broken by war, a teacher twisted by loneliness, a drifter who craved recognition. Psychologists who studied his letters painted a picture of a man obsessed with control. He did not kill for money, not for passion, not even for revenge. He killed for theater. Every letter was a stage, every cipher a script, every newspaper headline a standing ovation. The Zodiac was not content to spill blood. He needed to be seen, to be heard, to be feared. And in that he succeeded. The victims. But behind the myth, there were always real people. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, teenagers on their first date. Darlene Ferrin, a young mother full of life. Cecilia Shepard, who fought for her last breath by the waters of Lake Berryessa. Paul Stein, the cab driver whose shift ended with a bullet to the head. Their names risk being lost beneath the shadow of their killers. But they were not symbols. They were lives, stolen. And every cipher, every theory, every obsession is built upon their absence. The police and the failure of certainty. For decades, detectives chased the Zodiac. They had suspects' evidence, handwriting, fingerprints. They had raids, interrogations, searches. But they never had certainty. The Zodiac was like smoke. Whenever they thought they held him, he slipped away. And with every failure, his legend grew stronger. The cultural afterlife. The Zodiac's crimes ended half a century ago, but his afterlife is endless. Books, films, podcasts, forums, he has become a ghost story told in the language of true crime. A ritual of fear that Americans return to again and again, as if scratching at a scar that never heals. He is a predecessor to the age of serial killers, a grim prophecy of what was to come in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. Before Bundy, before Dahmer, before BTK, there was Zodiac, faceless, nameless, everywhere. Why he endures, what makes him different from other killers? It is not just the brutality of his crimes. Others killed more. Others killed with greater cruelty. It is the mystery, the unsolved ciphers, the unconfirmed suspects, the unanswered letters, the silence, because the human mind cannot stand silence. It fills it with fear, with speculation, with stories, and the Zodiac gave us silence wrapped in riddles framed in blood. The American darkness. The Zodiac is not just a man. He is a reflection of America itself, a land of highways stretching into lonely nights, a culture where fame can be bought in ink and terror. He represents the fear that anyone, your neighbor, your co-worker, the man in line at the grocery store, could be the face in the dark. He is the paranoia of a society that trusts the police to protect it and then watches as the police fail. He is the whisper that in America you are never truly safe. The final question. So who was he? Perhaps he was Gary Post, as some believe. Perhaps he was Arthur Lee Allen, forever suspicious. Perhaps he was someone whose name we will never know. Or perhaps the truth is crueler still, that the Zodiac has no face, no name, no single body. That he is an idea, a story told and retold until it becomes immortal. And if that is the truth, then he can never die. The face in the dark. Imagine for a moment the killer himself. An old man now if he lives. His hair white, his hands shaking. Sitting in a chair by a window watching children play outside. Perhaps he smiles. Not because of the memories of murder, but because he knows. He knows that his story has outlived him. That even now strangers speak his name, write his codes, search his face in the shadows. Perhaps he chuckles to himself the way he once wrote, "I am waiting for a good movie about me." Or perhaps he is gone, his bones beneath the earth, his secret safe forever. Either way, the result is the same. Because even now, as you hear these words, you are playing his game. You are thinking of him. You are giving him what he always wanted: attention, fear, immortality. Façon, the end that never ends. The story of the Zodiac Killer does not end in handcuffs. It does not end in trial or confession. It ends in mystery, and that perhaps is the cruelest ending of all, for in the silence of the unsolved, the Zodiac lives forever. The Zodiac Killer, Part 10, The Face in the Dark. The story of the Zodiac Killer is not just a story of murder. It is the story of a game, a riddle, a mirror held up to America's darkest fears. From the lonely highways of Northern California, to the newsrooms of San Francisco, to the screens of the 21st century, the Zodiac carved his symbol into history, not with bullets alone, not with knives, but with silence, with puzzles, with the endless hunger of human curiosity. The psychology of the Zodiac. Who was he? A soldier broken by war, a teacher twisted by loneliness, a drifter who craved recognition. Psychologists who studied his letters painted a picture of a man obsessed with control. He did not kill for money, not for passion, not even for revenge. He killed for theater. Every letter was a stage, every cipher a script, every newspaper headline a standing ovation. The Zodiac was not content to spill blood. He needed to be seen, to be heard, to be feared, and in that he succeeded. The victims, but behind the myth, there were always real people. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, teenagers on their first date. Darlene Ferrin, a young mother full of life. Cecilia Shepard, who fought for her last breath by the waters of Lake Berryessa. Paul Stein, the cab driver whose shift ended with a bullet to the head. Their names risk being lost beneath the shadow of their killers, but they were not symbols. They were lives, stolen. And every cipher, every theory, every obsession is built upon their absence. The police and the failure of certainty. For decades, detectives chased the Zodiac. They had suspects' evidence, handwriting, fingerprints. They had raids, interrogations, searches. But they never had certainty. The Zodiac was like smoke. Whenever they thought they held him, he slipped away. And with every failure, his legend grew stronger. The cultural afterlife. The Zodiac's crimes ended half a century ago. But his afterlife is endless. Books, films, podcasts, forums, he has become a ghost story told in the language of true crime. A ritual of fear that Americans return to again and again, as if scratching at a scar that never heals. He is a predecessor to the age of serial killers, a grim prophecy of what was to come in the 1970s, 80s, and beyond. Before Bundy, before Dahmer, before BTK, there was Zodiac, faceless, nameless, everywhere. Why he endures, what makes him different from other killers? It is not just the brutality of his crimes. Others killed more. Others killed with greater cruelty. It is the mystery, the unsolved ciphers, the unconfirmed suspects, the unanswered letters, the silence, because the human mind cannot stand silence. It fills it with fear, with speculation, with stories, and the Zodiac gave us silence wrapped in riddles framed in blood. The American darkness. The Zodiac is not just a man. He is a reflection of America itself, a land of highways stretching into lonely nights, a culture where fame can be bought in ink and terror. He represents the fear that anyone, your neighbor, your co-worker, the man in line at the grocery store, could be the face in the dark. He is the paranoia of a society that trusts the police to protect it and then watches as the police fail. He is the whisper that in America you are never truly safe. The final question. So who was he? Perhaps he was Gary Post, as some believe. Perhaps he was Arthur Lee Allen, forever suspicious. Perhaps he was someone whose name we will never know. Or perhaps the truth is crueler still, that the Zodiac has no face, no name, no single body. That he is an idea, a story told and retold until it becomes immortal. And if that is the truth, then he can never die. The face in the dark. Imagine for a moment the killer himself. An old man now if he lives. His hair white, his hands shaking. Sitting in a chair by a window watching children play outside. Perhaps he smiles. Not because of the memories of murder, but because he knows. He knows that his story has outlived him. That even now strangers speak his name, write his codes, search his face in the shadows. Perhaps he chuckles to himself the way he once wrote, "I am waiting for a good movie about me." Or perhaps he is gone, his bones beneath the earth, his secret safe forever. Either way, the result is the same. Because even now, as you hear these words, you are playing his game. You are thinking of him. You are giving him what he always wanted: attention, fear, immortality. Façon, the end that never ends. The story of the Zodiac Killer does not end in handcuffs. It does not end in trial or confession. It ends in mystery, and that perhaps is the cruelest ending of all. For in the silence of the unsolved, the Zodiac lives forever.